Good morning. It's good to be back on stage. I hope the history conversation was interesting. It's fun to get everybody talking a bit more dynamically about what happened then and what's going to happen going forward. For me, I mentioned this before, but it's great to be back in Frankfurt. I first encountered Frank Orlowski at a NANOG meeting in early 2010. He and Jo Whitman from Amsterdam were talking to each other, and I came over and said, "I want to see your internet exchange. Which one's the biggest?" And they both kind of looked at each other, checked their phones, see what the stats were that day, and then said, "Come, we'll open the doors. We'll show you what this is like. We'll talk a lot about what we do and what the internet is made of." That was about 5 years ago now. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about what the growth has been and how things have changed. But I'm very grateful, and was at the time and continue to be, for the way in which DE-CIX has been an open platform and has said we need to talk about this, we want to talk about this, we want to share what we do. So not just our customers understand it, but that the public at large and the billions of internet users around the world can understand it. I want to share some of the places that I visited and the things that I saw in going to look at the physical infrastructure of the internet. I thought this was kind of appropriate given the historical theme. This isn't 1995, this is 1987, with my dad at the Macworld Fair in Boston. A digital photograph, a kind of shocking, amazing thing. But for me, indicative of the path, the speed and the sort of, at least fully my lifetime, I think I'm exactly the same age as my father was in that picture, but of how quickly things have changed, and that this is all in recent memory, but it bears repeating, and there's still a lot of stories to be told with all of it. The entry for me wasn't 1987, or 1995, but was 2008. I was working as a journalist for Wired. I was writing mostly about architecture, about buildings. And the reason I wanted to write about architecture was because it seemed like it would be interesting to go out and see these places and be out in the world. And that wasn't happening at all. I was being sent pictures of buildings and said, "Okay, write about these from these pictures." And that was a pretty marked shift in the way that I was engaging with the world. I was sitting at my desk all day. I was sitting in front of my screen. It was also the year that I got an iPhone, and so all of us were now walking down the street, not looking up at the world, but instead we're walking down the street with this phone in our hands, this other screen, and our attention was always divided. We had the real world around us, and we had the world inside the screen. And what was really striking to me, as somebody who had come at this from writing about physical places, was that the world inside the screen seemed to have no physical reality at all. And when you went to look for pictures of the internet, this was always the picture of the internet. What does the internet look like? It looks like this blob. It looks like this thing that has always reminded me of the Apollo, the blue marble picture of the Earth, where you're not really supposed to, you're just supposed to kind of be in awe of it. You're not really supposed to pick out where you are, or pick out which of these strands is your network. You're just supposed to kind of admire the full expanse of it. You're supposed to say the internet is this amorphous, remarkable thing, that's changed revolutions and dating and all of that. But we're not really going to talk about the parts and pieces, at least not in the public. And this divide between the world inside my screen that seemed to have no physical world at all, and my own interest in in looking at the physical world and saying, okay, who built it? Why is it there? Started to rankle me. It started to be very confusing to me that I couldn't kind of get inside there. When that began to change, was one day when this happened, and my internet at home broke. This remarkable thing happened to me that I've been talking about since, which is the cable guy came to fix it, and he followed the wire from the cable behind my couch out to the backyard of my building in Brooklyn, and then he saw a squirrel running across the wire, and he said this thing that changed my life, which is that a squirrel is chewing on your internet. And it seemed bizarre and remarkable because, again, the internet is this amorphous blob. The internet is this thing that's changed life on Earth as we know it. But the internet is not something that squirrels chew on. But in fact, it was. The squirrel had chewed on my internet. And what I quickly came to was just this very simple thing that if a squirrel could chew on that piece of the internet, there had to be other pieces of the internet that squirrels could chew on. And all I had to do was yank the cable from the wall and follow it, and keep going and see who I would find and where I would find them and why they were there and what they had built there. And that's what I began to do. But almost as quickly as I did that, I felt really stupid about it, because only fools go to look for the internet. This is the episode of South Park where the internet breaks, but they go to Starbucks because that's where you get the internet, but the internet's broken at Starbucks too. So they end up being kind of internet refugees in California because that's where the internet is, as we all know. And finally they come to this place, which is the internet. And they do everything they can to fix it. They shoot at it, and they play the music from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but that doesn't turn it back on. And then finally one of the little guys runs up the ramp, and he unplugs it, and he plugs it back in. And then he says, the flashing yellow light is steady green, salvation, the world is saved. The internet works. And I felt pretty stupid when my sister-in-law sent this to me and said, you realize this is what it means to go look for the internet. This is the butt of jokes. This isn't actually something people really do. And it indicated to me that there wasn't really a way of talking about this. All of the words we use to describe what the internet is, all of our metaphors for it are a bit broken. This is more recent. This is from a few years ago. But it's remarkable to me that I don't know the answer to this question. I could not tell you definitively if cloudy weather interferes with cloud computing. Of course, yes, there are storms that might take out data centers, but no, cloud computing is not in the cloud. And clearly, the responsible public were evenly divided on this question as well. I won't ask for a show of hands on whether or not what the answer to this question is. But for me, it was a bit of a rallying cry to say, okay, well, how can we begin to think of a new way of describing what the internet's made of and how it's fit together? And I ended up calling my editor at Wired and saying, we forgot about the wires. What can we do about this? He said, this is amazing. Let's do it. We're going to do a photo essay. And you have to find the most beautiful pieces of the internet. And this turned out to be one of the most beautiful pieces of the internet. This was a fiber optic regeneration hut in the middle of Kansas, which we came to because we said, okay, is there like a spot in the middle of the country where the signal is regenerated? Kansas is the middle of the United States. This is the middle of Kansas. And I had a very bizarre conversation with an engineer in Kansas City, a guy with a white pickup truck who was responsible for maintaining all of the regen huts in a 500-mile radius, and saying, okay, which is the best of them? Where should we go? What's the most beautiful? And this is what the photographer came back with. But it, for me, indicated a sort of change in approach. Rather than sort of following the bits, rather than saying, okay, let me trace the path of a single email, let me trace what happens across geography when a single web page loads. What if I stand in one spot? What if I kind of plant my feet and say, okay, what's passing through here? How does the history of these places and how does the function of these places look different if your feet are planted rather than if you're kind of trying to move at the speed of light? And a lot of different stories come up. But it also meant an abandonment of the logical. That might sound completely crazy to network folks or to computer folks, but for me it said, okay, I'm going to ignore the logical as much as possible, and instead I'm going to focus on the physical and what the internet's made of, and I'm going to focus on the geographic, on where it is, because those are things I can see and those are things I can touch, and say, okay, if I ignore that and I just focus on these two places, these two things, on the machines and the objects and the buildings, and focus on the geography, on why they are where they are, what kinds of stories come up and what do we begin to learn. The physical part was more straightforward than I realized. There were cables filled with light. I started to think about the yellow fiber optic cable as the kind of the basic building block of the internet. the thing that connects networks, the actual piece, the inter and internet. This is what's connecting two routers, one to the other. And then I started to say, okay, well, where are the most important places? Where are the places where, where more networks connect than anywhere else? And was surprised at how consistent the answers of network engineers were. There were lists, of course. There was a good Wikipedia page of the biggest internet exchange points, but it didn't capture the sort of full sense of both in the US and Europe and around the world of where the most important internet places were. You always ended up with this list of world capitals, of Frankfurt, of London, of Amsterdam, of New York, of Ashburn. Ashburn, Virginia, not a world capital, but a capital of the internet, an outlier in that sense, that there are these places that were far more important than you would give them credit to. This was and kind of continues to be my favorite center of the internet. This is 60 Hudson Street in New York, built as the Western Union Building, as the Telegraph Building. But through its own very specific history, through some facts of geography, something about its location in Lower Manhattan, at the elbow of the financial district and the first way out of town to the west, and something about the particular salesmanship that brought networks, particularly in the broadband boom, to this building, made it one of these places in the world, Frankfurt, another one certainly, where more networks connect than other, made it one of these sort of capitals of the internet. With a history that in this building's case isn't completely continuous, but is surprising that once this geography is established, once these places are centers of telecommunications, they don't really change. They grow, but they don't really change. So this is a picture. This is my from the tube center. Tube meaning pneumatic tube. In the at 60 Hudson, with the Western Union telegraphs being shuffled around the building through this incredibly, not a strand of glass, but a tube filled with air to get the messages around town. Or the contemporary version. This is Telecity here in Frankfurt, a more recent photograph. This is what the internet looks like, right? I mean, this is what it becomes. It always has this quality where you don't really know what's going on. You don't really see anything, but we know that it's here. We know that it's in a specific spot. We know that the center of these exchanges are single or pairs of machines, and that we can go visit them. You can smell them. They have a distinct smell. I know a lot of you spent lots of time in data centers, but there's a physical quality to them that I think goes a long way towards bringing the cloud, this thing we don't really know what it is, back to the familiar world that we understand a lot better. And that's at a human scale. I mean, yes, we talk about billions of people and we talk about the internet scaling geography, but it's always coming back to a network engineer plugging a yellow cable into a router, into a switch, from one to the other, making that interconnection in the internet. This is always my favorite part of a data center tour. Data centers, as a lot of you know, they're cold and they're loud, and there's always a spot where whoever's giving you a tour, takes out a thick ring of keys and opens up usually an unmarked door, or sometimes the door says fiber vault, and you walk into a room like this, and rather than being cold and loud, it's quiet and it's hot, and it smells like dirt. And the reason it smells like dirt is because this is where the cables come out of the ground. And this is the connection between the physical, between what the internet's made of, and the geographic and where it is. This is where the internet kind of connects to the earth. And I think that becomes, for me, a really powerful reminder that, again, yes, you can talk about software-defined networking and you can talk about the ease at which these things are connected, but there is always that physical piece, and there is always somebody who's put that piece in, often kind of crouched over, looking kind of annoyed, wearing a hoodie, trying to figure out what this is made of. So if the internet exchange points were the kind of first sort of category of major internet places, the second category for me are the places and the lines in between, the things that connect, the cables that connect different parts of the world. Most remarkably, the undersea cables. This is another photograph taken by Randall Mesden, who where it was a similar question. It was, okay, if there are undersea cables across the ocean, what happens when they land? What does it look like? Is there a manhole? And if, yes, turns out there is a manhole. And then the question was, okay, which is the most beautiful manhole? And this is the most beautiful manhole. This is outside of Halifax, where the Hibernia Atlantic cable lands. And for me, it was a recognition that if there's a human scale to it, it's in this dimension. It's standing in one spot where you can hold an undersea cable in your hand, at least in diameter, and it's the size of a garden hose, maybe a little bit thicker. But in the other dimension, the long way, it's thousands of miles, and it connects continents. And that contrast, I think, says a lot about the way in which the internet's built, that it's only, yes, it is about these single places, but it's also about expanding these very large places. So how does that happen? It seemed like there was a moment where this connection happened, where new connections were made when a cable arrives on a new continent or a new cable is installed. And I really wanted to see that. It doesn't happen all that often. This man was my ticket to see that. Does anyone know Simon? Simon used to be around a lot more. Yeah, okay. This is Simon Cooper, who at the time worked for Tata, who at the time were laying a lot of new cables. And I said, can you? We've never met. We've only met through the internet. But I was wondering where, where are new cables being built? And there were some places that were either difficult or dangerous to get to, or very far away. And then he said, I'll work on it and let you know. And he called me on a Thursday and said, if you can get to Portugal at 9 o'clock Monday morning, this man will walk out of the water, which is what happened. And this seems somewhat bizarre. Could this really be the way that a cable connecting continents begins? And it is. He starts out with this messenger line, with a lightweight nylon line, and he jumps out of a dinghy and he brings it up on the beach. And then it's brought out to a special cable laying ship. This cable was laid by Alcatel-Lucent. You see the Alcatel-Lucent engineers kind of carefully keeping an eye on things. You see the kind of local laborers doing the heavy lifting. You see the digger, the construction guy, who in this case specialized in demolishing historic buildings in Lisbon, but because he was so delicate, the way the foreman described it to me was that he could scratch your nose with the bucket of his digger, and you wouldn't mind, because that's how good a digger driver he was to deal with this cable. And they bring it in on the buoys, and once it's in place, the diver goes back in the water with a machete, and he cuts the buoys off, and the buoys pop up in the air, and he swims out the whole kilometer to the ship, and when he gets there, they give him a glass of juice and a cookie, and then he jumps back in the water and he swims back to shore and he gets out, lights a cigarette. And then they get to work on it, where they go at it with a hacksaw to begin to peel back the layers of steel armor, the plastic, the waterproofing, until they find, I think in this case, the 8 strands of fiber inside. So if the question is, does the internet exist? Is the internet physical? When you begin to see these two guys going at the cable with a hacksaw, it's really clear that yes, the internet absolutely is a physical thing. And not only is it a physical thing, but it's basically what it's always been, particularly the undersea cables. This is from the 1920s, from Hong Kong, where it's the same situation. You see the British engineers in the back, you see the local laborers in the front, and you see what they're carrying isn't made of fiber, it's made of copper. But it's a reminder that yes, that the technology is new, but the way in which the cables and the continents are connected stays the same. That it's basically the same map. The cables are basically connecting the same list of port cities, whether it's London or Mombasa or Mumbai or Singapore or New York. These are the places that the cables connect. Marcus Cresceccia, who's a cartographer at Telegeography, company I'm sure a lot of you know well. He, a couple of years ago, in his annual submarine cable map, played with this idea and said, okay, if we recognize that these paths have been the same for a long time, how, let's have fun with that. Let's make this some more. Let's acknowledge the history of these places and the history of these connections between cables in his great map. And then after this whole process is done, where they're bringing the cable up on the beach, here's another manhole, another cable manhole. The whole town, it was a village a little bit south of Lisbon, the whole town kind of was watching this go on over 3 or 4 days. Then they finished fusing the fiber inside the manhole up to the cable landing station, a couple miles up the hill. And then they put the manhole cover back on, and they push the sand over it. And then everybody forgets about it. We forget about it, they forget about it. The village goes back to what it was doing. And we don't acknowledge that these cables are actually the things that connect us. They are the basis of international communication. It's interesting to hear with DE-CIX expansion that Palermo and Marseille are not about local markets, they're about cable landing sites. It's a real sort of big arrow, kind of big bullseye saying these are the places where the connections are hottest. These are the places where there's the most to be gained by allowing as many networks to connect in that international way. So rather than, if before the manhole was covered and we forgot about it, the acknowledgement of those hubs, I think, begins to shift the picture of that. So the third piece, if there are the cables, if there are the exchange points, the places where networks meet, as one kind of piece of the geography of the internet, and the second piece are the lines in between. The third piece are, of course, the very large data centers, particularly the content providers. This is my photograph from the woods behind Facebook's data center in Prineville, Oregon, their first ground-up data center. Completely coincidentally, I happened to be there the day that it went online to the internet. And I thought it was going to be a kind of belching factory. That was the sort of image of these places that had been painted as the data centers way off in the coolest, driest place with the cheapest power. Instead, what surprised me was that Facebook, in this case and other cases, had built a monument. And for me, as a writer originally about architecture, I know that buildings express ideas, that you don't just ignore them, but they say something about the people who built them. So rather than this sense of the internet being something hidden and not discussed as physical infrastructure, here was a moment where Facebook really wanted to show it off, where they said, this is where we keep your stuff, and we're going to build a building that begins to reflect that. And that's continued. You see that in a lot of new data centers in particular, where in part there's the marketing imperative and say we need to show off what these places are and how high tech they are, whether that's a building like the new Telehouse in London or some of Equinix's different buildings in the U.S. But also to say that these are the monuments, the kind of the temples of the internet, and they should be acknowledged as such. And yet, when I got inside and said, okay, if I'm going to visit the internet, I have arrived. This is ostensibly the container of some of the most, on Facebook on a good day, the most sort of, wedding pictures or baby pictures or whatever it is. This is where it's held. I was struck that I couldn't make that final leap. I couldn't say, okay, I'm here. This is where the stuff is. Great. That feels good. There was still that disconnection between the physical and the geographic, and the logical between what's written on the drives is always going to be almost impossible to meet, and that's going to be confusing for a lot of people for a long time, I think. Facebook was also striking in contrast with its neighbor about 150 miles down the road. This is in the place called the Dalles in Oregon. It was striking to me that both Google and Facebook made the decision to build their first ground-up data centers in the world in basically the same place, in the same region at least. This is the old Google Maps image of Google's data center in the Dalles. There's a newer image up now, but for a long time, not only was the data center not talked about, but it was literally scrubbed out. The buildings are here when the satellite passed, but they were photoshopped out. They were erased. And that's a pretty striking acknowledgement, first, of a kind of first rule of geography, that those who make the maps have the power, but also of the extent to which this was the place you did not talk about. And indeed, it's changed now. There is a sign now, but at the time, the only sign on the door of Google's data center was Voldemort Industries. A little bit of a joke, a Harry Potter joke of he whose name we do not speak. And it was remarkable for me because I had visited a lot of places by this point, and everybody had understood the importance of explaining what their piece of the internet did. And Google ended up being a very striking exception, where they said, yes, come see our place, and then gave me what amounted to a tour of the parking lot. And I said, what are these buildings? What goes on inside? What can you tell me about them? And the answer was, I'm sure that's information we have, but it's not something we can discuss. Yes, I'm sure you do know what's going on inside these buildings, but okay. It was a stock answer. It was saying, we do not talk about what goes on inside. We ended up just taking a walk across the parking lot and seeing the Googlers' organic garden, but it was wintertime, so it was sort of like, thanks for coming, here's our patch of dirt, and then we had a nice lunch. But it was amazing to me that this was the outlier, that while every other place had understood the need for talking about what goes on here and what this infrastructure is made of, it took Google a long time to catch up, which is ironic, particularly given Google as an organizer and source of information. And it was a bit of a red flag of saying, okay, well, what is going on? What are the reasons for this? Are they purely competitive? Who owns these places? How do we sort of recognize that they're here and recognize what they have and recognize all the things that we put in the cloud and who might be looking into those things without acknowledging what they're actually made of and who they are? That's changed in lots of ways. It's changed with the Snowden revelations with the NSA. It's changed with a culture now that is much more transparent about how data centers work. It's changed so much that when you look for a picture of the internet, this is now the picture of the internet that appears. This is Google's data center in a photo taken by Google, and later another similar one, another on the set discovered to be kind of photoshopped, but still, this is now a new image of the internet. And there has been an amazing shift towards talking about these places more, and towards saying, okay, this is what the internet looks like in real life. This is only one example of what the internet looks like in real life. But Henrik Holgrief, who's a German photographer, who also took those pictures of DE-CIX, has been doing an amazing project, traveling around, taking pictures of the internet in all its physical manifestations. But I laugh because, again, there was no image of the internet, and now we're talking about this is what the internet looks like. And it's no, this is what the internet looks like. No, okay, this is what the internet looks like. It's still this blob. It's still this diagram. But I'm not entirely sure, so maybe this is the internet in real life. Again and again and again, we have this refrain of, no, this is what the internet looks like. So we begin to see that this sort of curiosity and the ways of talking about what the internet is actually made of, it becomes a much broader topic of conversation, driven both by, I think, the adoption of the cloud and the need to back that up, as well as by the ongoing conversation about surveillance. But this is kind of my dream for what it will look like. Not this, not look like this, but act like this. This is the Bonneville Dam just down the road from Google's data center in the Dalles. It provides power for a lot of the region. It's run by the Army Corps of Engineers. It's a fortress, basically. You go through a tunnel to get through a mountain. A guard checks your trunk and then says, come on in. And then you go inside, and there's a gift shop and a fish ladder where you watch the salmon jump up. And there's no doubt that this is strategic infrastructure. There's no doubt that this is a place that has to be protected. But we found a way to talk about it and to acknowledge it, and to say that this belongs in some ways to all of us, and should be acknowledged as such. So, and I think that sense of the infrastructure of the internet as a public good is really beginning to come into the forefront. So, I'll leave it there. Thank you.